So today I'm going to talk to you about metaphors of aging in Marcel Proust's writing, which, as Marjorie just said, is also the topic of my PhD project. And I'm going to start by briefly introducing my project and also the reasoning behind my choice of metaphors as an object of study in La Recherche, as well as my theoretical approach to metaphor, before presenting and analyzing small excerpts from Le Bal de Têtes that revolve around the metaphors life is a journey and people are plants. And then I'll make some concluding remarks at the end. Now, both in my dissertation and in my talk today, I am going to focus on a relatively small part of Proust's rather long novel, À la recherche du temps perdu, which has been translated as both Remembrance of Things Past and In Search of Lost Time into English. And all the quotes that I'm going to show you later on are taken from the Remembrance of Things Past translation. So the smaller part that I'm working on is found at the end of the last volume. There are 7 volumes that make up this novel. The last one is called Le Temps Retrouvé, which has been translated as both Time Regained and Time Recaptured. And so the last about 130 pages of this last volume is called Le Bal de Têtes, which can be translated as The Masked Ball. And in Le Bal de Têtes, the narrator of La Recherche, he attends a reception at the mansion of the Prince and the Princess of Guermantes. And at this reception, he meets again a lot of his friends and acquaintances, but he has been away from Paris for some time. So as he enters the reception, he struggles to recognize the other guests. And he asks himself why they're wearing disguises or masks. But then after a short while, he realizes that they're not wearing masks or disguises. It's just that they've changed since he last saw them, because they've aged. And this comes as a shock to the narrator, who until this moment apparently hasn't been fully aware of the passing of time. And also, just before entering this reception, he's been waiting in a library and he's been reflecting on how metaphor and memory can help him to sort of recapture and counter the effects of time. So there's quite an effective shock when he is confronted with all these aged people, and it makes him realize that he must have aged himself as well, because time has moved on for him as well. So the narrator describes many of the characters that he meets, and the descriptions are often not very flattering. Kathleen Woodward has even called Le Bal de Têtes the most trenchant and sustained satirical description of the elderly in Western literature. However, Woodward also claims that the narrator's ideas about aging, work, and time are contradictory and convoluted. So while many of the characters in Le Bal de Têtes are portrayed in rather a negative way, I will argue in this presentation that there are descriptions that in different ways nuance this impression. So in my research, I focus on the metaphors in Proust's writing. And one of the reasons why I have chosen to do so is the fact that the metaphor plays such an important role in La Recherche. It has the ability to capture a kind of essence and give us access to a timeless or eternal dimension of reality. And metaphor is also, according to Proust, closely related to the involuntary memory, which is another possible gateway to an extratemporal dimension. Now, my approach to Proustian metaphor is based on cognitive metaphor theory, as well as Paul Ricoeur's tensional metaphor theory. And I'm not going to go into any details here, I'm just going to try and give you an idea of the most important aspects of these theories. So cognitive metaphor theory claims that metaphor is not, as traditional views would have it, a literary device where you replace one word with another. Instead, it is a fundamental part of human cognition. And an important distinction set up by cognitive metaphor theory is that between conceptual metaphor and metaphoric expressions. So a conceptual metaphor is a thought structure that can be expressed linguistically in many different ways. And as a result, different metaphoric expressions can be realizations of the same conceptual metaphor. So I'm going to show you an example, make it a bit easier. A very common conceptual metaphor, which actually links a bit to what Emily was talking about earlier, is the metaphor people are plants. And this metaphor forms the basis for expressions such as she is blossoming or he is withering away. So when we talk about people like this, we're using this metaphor. Now these expressions are conventional, and they will often not even be perceived as metaphorical when we use them in everyday language. But as I will show you later on, there are other unconventional metaphoric expressions based on this metaphor in Le Bal de Têtes. So what cognitive metaphor theory does then is that it makes it easier to see the connections between different metaphoric expressions. And if you have read Proust, you will know that there are numerous rather long passages where metaphors are intertwined, forming complex webs. And cognitive metaphor theory can help untangle these webs and provide an overview of the metaphoric structure of these passages. Now, Ricoeur's tensional metaphor theory has some important points in common with cognitive metaphor theory, the most fundamental one being that metaphor is more than an ornament. But the most important reason why I am including Ricoeur's theory in my work is his view on tension in metaphor. So according to cognitive metaphor theory, metaphor highlights some aspects in creating similarities between two concepts, but at the same time, it downplays or hides others. So in this way, metaphor becomes more logical. But to Ricoeur, the differences between the two concepts remain present in the metaphor, held in tension with the similarities. So metaphor is paradoxical, and it expresses both what is and what is not at the same time. And this view is helpful when trying to account for the paradox that is time in La Recherche. It is both slipping through our fingers, being lost, and at the same time it's being recaptured through memory and through art. Now there's no denying that most of the metaphors used to describe the characters in Le Bal de Têtes are negative. The characters are seen as beggars, insects, animals, dolls, and statues, among many other things. And time, which is personified as the agent behind the transformations of these characters, is both an unconscientious and malevolent artist producing bad portraits, as well as a maker of masks. At any rate, the main tendency is that the characters have become uglier since the last time the narrator saw them, and both their bodies and their minds have deteriorated in many cases. However, it is interesting how the narrator repeatedly and explicitly points out that time and aging affect people very differently. Some, he says, look the same, and they only seem inconvenienced when they have to walk. And others have changed not only in appearance, but in personality as well. Some have even gone from being unbearable to having almost entirely lost their defects. And quite often, after having described one character or a group of characters, the narrator moves on to describe others who are marked by the passing of time in a different way. Now, at one point, the narrator remarks that the beat of time itself can in certain cases be accelerated or slowed down. And he goes on to contrast the Vicomtesse de Saint-Fiacre, who, although still young, looks much older and has changed a lot since the last time he saw her. And then she's contrasted with a gentleman called Monsieur de Courgivault, who is past 50, but hardly even looks like he is 30. And this difference is in part attributed to different lifestyles. While Monsieur de Courgivault has found an excellent doctor and he's been avoiding alcohol and salt, the Vicomtesse has been taking cocaine and other drugs. But it is clear that the narrator also sees the transformation of these two characters as caused by time as well. And he uses a train metaphor to explain this effect. Time has these express and special trains which bring about premature old age, But on a parallel line, return trains circulate, which are almost as rapid. So the express trains to premature old age are special. And one might assume then that there are ordinary trains as well, which bring passengers at a slower pace towards old age, leaving them at the destination at the expected time, so not prematurely. Now, the train is what cognitive metaphor theory would call an elaboration of the conventional conceptual metaphor, life is a journey, which is also a metaphor that we use all the time when we say things like finding one's path in life, being at a crossroads, etc. And this metaphor is elaborated or specified here, making the journey a journey by train. But another option is also added that we don't normally find, because usually the journey of life is unidirectional. So we're born, we start on a journey, and the journey ends when we die. And we might talk about detours or distractions, but it's not at all common to talk about returning, that there is a sort of parallel line and that you can go backwards. And the return train here suggests that there could be alternative ways of aging that differ dramatically from the typical slow train journey towards old age. And that aging does not necessarily entail a deterioration in the same way for everyone, at least. Now, Monsieur de Courgivaux certainly belongs to a minority, but he nonetheless proves that it is possible for some people to avoid the changes brought on by age. So the train metaphor shows us how life is a train journey towards old age, and at the same time, how it is not. Or at least how it does not need to be, because it can be a train journey towards youth, apparently. Now, while Monsieur de Courgivaux has caught a return train, and as a result seems younger rather than older, Odette, or Madame de Forcheville, who is an important character present throughout La Recherche, has not aged at all. And thus it is the fact that she is not changed that prevents the narrator from recognizing her. So when he does recognize her, he remarks, Madame de Forcheville presented an appearance so miraculous that one would have said not that she had grown young, but that with all her carmine and rouge, she had reflowered. She could have been the chief attraction of a horticultural exhibition today. So here, Proust makes use of the conceptual metaphor people are plants, which, as I mentioned earlier, forms the basis for lots of expressions that we use all the time. But again, we see that the metaphor is extended to include more possibilities than it does in the conventional use of it. Because normally we would only apply one cycle of a plant's life to the human life, so from seed to sprout and bloom, which proceeds to wither and die. But in this instance, Proust gives Odette the possibility to reflower. So presumably after having already flowered and then starting to wither, at least to some degree. And this echoes the return train in permitting the characters to not undergo the typical, or perhaps stereotypical, unidirectional process of aging. Now, in the majority of the descriptions of the narrator's friends and acquaintances, the changes caused by time are seen as negative ones. And this could make one think that Odette's unchanged face would be seen in a more positive light. But there is something almost uncanny about it. To the narrator, because she had not changed, she seemed hardly to be living. She was like a sterilized rose. And he also remarks a bit earlier in the text that Odette looks as though she had been injected with paraffin, which swells the skin and prevents it from sagging. Now, paraffin was indeed used to correct wrinkles and other signs of aging in the early 20th century, so it's not unthinkable that Odette has in fact had an injection of it in order to look younger. But this way of trying to counter the effects of time does not quite have the desired effect. Instead, it leaves Odette looking sterilized, as we saw, and even embalmed for eternity. So though Odette has evaded the transformations undergone by the other guests, and she has achieved a kind of timelessness, this timelessness is not the living kind that Proust and his narrator seek through memory and through art. She has, in a sense, reflowered, But this reflowering is very different from the reflowering of a plant, which blooms again each spring and each time looks as full of life as ever. Odette's youthful looks are every bit as much of a stiffened mask as the faces of the other characters. And alongside words such as sterilized and embalmed, they also evoke death, but in a different, more eerie way, since she at first glance looks young and beautiful. So the metaphoric reflowering of Odette is thus a paradoxical one, and it is a good example of the tension that Ricoeur sees as inherent in metaphor. She has reflowered, but at the same time, she has not really reflowered. So she seems both alive and dead at the same time. Now, time is, of course, a concept closely related to that of aging, and Proust's view of time is a paradoxical one, as I've already mentioned. So it's slipping away, being lost, and it also contains the possibility of being recaptured. And the narrator sets out to recapture the lost time, but this he would not have been able to do if it had not already been lost. So these two aspects of time are very much dependent on each other. Even though one is valued more, it can't exist without the other. And the changes caused by time are inescapable for most people, perhaps with the exception of Monsieur de Courgivaux. So when Odette tries to escape these changes, not by reconnecting with her past through memory or through art, but merely by holding their effects at bay in an artificial manner, the youth that she holds on to is also an artificial one. It's lifeless as opposed to the memories experienced by the narrator, who seem more real even than the material world that surrounds him. So while aging may not always be beautiful, it is necessary and it is inescapable, and attempts to avoid aging are futile. They may result in the appearance of not having aged, but one risks ending up like Odette, looking beautiful but sterilized and embalmed. Now, as I've said, time and aging are inescapable. We all undergo changes as we get older, and in Le Bal de Têtes, even those who at first glance seem unaffected by time and by age, they turn out to have changed in some small ways. So while Proust's narrator is shocked and appalled by the changed appearances of his friends and acquaintances, the examples that I've shown you still seem to imply that the alternative is not necessarily better. Those who remain relatively unchanged are not necessarily described in a very flattering way either. So what makes it possible to argue that Le Bal de Têtes is not only, at least, the most trenchant and sustained satirical description of the elderly in Western literature, as Kathleen would have it, is the insistence on the multitude of ways in which people age. Now, for time reasons, I haven't been able to show you loads of examples. I'd love to have shown you more, but it really is striking when you read it, how he describes some people, then he goes on, so that was them, and here is another example of how someone else aged in an entirely different way, and that just keeps on for 130 pages, basically. So even though many of them have changed for the worse, that's not necessarily the case for all, and those who have changed in their own way. So they're not just put in the same box of being old and ugly. They retain a certain individuality, and there are different aspects of them that have changed. Now, this episode, Le Bal de Têtes, also has an important function for the narrator as a writer, because the encounter with all these aged characters is what spurs him to go on and write the work that he's been planning throughout all the former volumes of La Recherche. So just before it, he realizes that he can use memory and art to counter the effects of time, but he has all throughout the almost 7 volumes been putting off starting his work. But when he sees all these other changed people, he realizes that I might not have that much time left. So if I'm going to do this, I have to start now. Thank you.